Today I'm doing my July wrap up. Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl. I read so much more than I thought I was going to in July. The first book I read in July was The Extraordinary Deaths of Mrs. Kipp by Sarah Brunsvold. I read this with my mom for our Inklings group. This was one of this year's 5-star reads for me. I absolutely loved it. I didn't know what to expect going in. This made me get teary-eyed multiple times. And I felt like there were so many good nuggets of wisdom in this book. It tells the story of a young woman who works for a newspaper, and she goes to this nursing home where Mrs. Kipp is at. She's told that she is going to be writing her obituary. I don't want to give too much more than that, but it's such a good, heartwarming story, and it definitely has stayed with me. So I wrote down a couple of quotes from it. He is a God of new life, and fear is an invitation to remember who God is. I'd started reading 8 Great Smarts by Kathy Cook. I didn't think that was how her name was pronounced, but she went to the conference my daughter was at in June, and that is how she pronounced it herself there, apparently. So that's what I'm going to go with. This just went through different intelligences to help you kind of figure out how to help your child. And I thought this was good. There was some information that I felt was better than others. I did get some helpful information from it. I started to read that in June and then finished it in July. Then I finally got to When the Day Comes by Gabriel Meyer. And this definitely lived up to the hype for me. I've heard some people say that they thought this was predictable, but I actually didn't find it predictable. I had an idea in my mind of what was going to happen, and I was pretty sure that it was going to happen, but then that made me think that probably the other thing was going to happen. By the end, I kept predicting things throughout the whole thing, and I was right about a few things, but some of them I was wrong about. I thought that the ending was fantastic. I'm definitely going to continue on with the series. This is the one with the girl that was living in 2 different time periods, and then she has to choose by a certain birth date which one she wants to continue on in. This actually made me look up things in history as well. It made me look up the Millionaire Row in New York City that is now gone, unfortunately, and I looked at all those old houses and read things about the people. I just really enjoyed the story. I do have to give a content warning because I didn't get one, and there might be some people that would like to know that this does contain a rape. It's not explicit, and it's not all on the page. It is definitely there and implied. I really do think this is one of those books that lived up to the hype. To be continued. I'm back. This is a couple of hours later. My mom showed up right then for our Inklings get together. So we just spent a few hours discussing this book. It was such a good discussion. We both had so much to say, and we both got so much out of this book. The next book I read was Sky of Paper Stars. This is by Susie Yee, and this is a graphic novel, and I read this before having my daughters read it. It's a story of a young Korean girl who doesn't really feel like she fits in here in the United States where she lives, and she thinks that she'll fit in better in Korea, and then she goes there and doesn't feel like she fits in there. There's a whole story with her grandma here. I don't want to give away too much, but I thought it was a nice story. I didn't love it as much as I expected to, but I did enjoy it, and I think it had a good message. And so far, my youngest daughter has read it, and she did enjoy it. So later when I go through the books that she's read for school over this last little while, I won't mention this one again, but she did enjoy it. Then for Emma at the Bookish Princesses book club, they were reading Mansfield Park. I mentioned that I needed to read Mansfield Park for my literature course, and I wanted to reread at least one Jane Austen book in July. And so I chose to read this along with Emma's book club. And my opinion of this book is actually the same as it was the very first time I read it. And that is that I think it's an interesting book. Her writing is always great. There's always levels to it. There's always more to kind of dig into. And this is definitely no exception to that. But that said, it is either my least favorite or second least favorite, because Emma has always been my least favorite. But I know that I need to reread that because so many people love it so much. I unfortunately was not able to make it to the book club discussion. I'm sure that that was really good, and I probably would have got more out of it if I'd been able to make it to that as well and hear what other people were saying. But I'm glad that I was at least able to reread this. Next, I read Pygmalion. This is a play by George Bernard Shaw. When my mom and I read the book for Inklings that was about the flower sellers in England, it talked about Pygmalion, and so I wanted to read it. This is almost exactly the same story as My Fair Lady. They definitely changed some things for the movie, and surprisingly, I liked this. For the most part, I liked this better. There were some parts of this that were really poignant and deep, and then there were other parts that were just really funny. Since it's in play form, it was a very quick read, and I did write down a few quotes from it. Man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask and he will tell you the truth. And that's a quote from Oscar Wilde, but it was in this book. Would the world ever have been made if its maker had been afraid of making trouble? Making life means making trouble. There's only one way of escaping trouble, and that's killing things. Cowards, you notice, are always shrieking to have troublesome people killed. I definitely recommend Pygmalion. I'd also been meaning to get to Loyally Luke by Pepper Basham for a long time, and I was able to get to this one in July. I really like Luke. I think I said that in the video where I talked about wanting to read this book, that in Authentically Izzy and Positively Penelope, I really liked the character of Luke. So I was excited to get his story, and I did really like him still. I feel like this book repeated itself a lot with their fillings for each other. Sometimes it felt a little bit more Hallmarky than, I mean, that was kind of a running gag because there's a lot of references to that in the book. But I would say now that I've read the 3 that are out, Authentically Izzy, I think, is still the best one. That's my favorite one. I do think it's a lot better than Positively Penelope and Loyally Luke, but I also like Loyally Luke better than Positively Penelope. So this one's my second favorite of the 3, and I liked all 3 of them. They're all enjoyable. I also mentioned in my TBR for August that I was going to be reading the 3rd book in a trilogy my oldest daughter wrote. And so leading up to August, I read the 1st and 2nd books. Those were great. They were really fun. I enjoyed reading them again, but she doesn't want me to show them on here. Then I read Submerged by Danny Petrie. This tells a story of a young girl who has lived in this little town in Alaska. She doesn't have a great reputation, and she has left and she hasn't been back for a while. And when there's a family death, she has to come back to the town to deal with the death and go to the funeral. And while she's there, she gets kind of wrapped up in the investigation of the death, and people are dying. It was a pretty good book. I enjoyed it. There were a few parts that were a little bit gruesome. I wouldn't say that they were overly gory, but for sensitive readers, I think they would be a little bit. I heard a few people say that they didn't like this book, and so I kind of went into it with lower expectations, and I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I was going to. It was really tense, and I had a hard time putting it down sometimes because I wanted to know what would happen. I felt like it had good faith content, especially for a book that's a thriller. It was a little bit repetitive occasionally, and there were a couple of plot points that I felt like were not quite explained. Maybe they would be in sequels, but there were a few things that didn't completely pan out for me. But the funniest thing about it to me was, if you've read Twilight and read this book, maybe you'll understand what I'm talking about. But there was a character in this named Piper, and she was a sister of the main boy character. She reminded me of Alice, Edward's sister in Twilight. And once that happened and I started seeing that in her, I started noticing it in the other characters too. And I felt like his whole family kind of felt like the Cullens in Twilight. I don't know if that was on purpose or if she has even read Twilight, I don't know. But they kind of felt like the Cullen family, but without being vampires. In my morning reading, I finished this book by Heidi St. John. It's called Romance: Nurturing Your Marriage Through the Homeschool Years. This was just a really simple little guidebook, I guess. It was a little bit more surface level than I expect from something from Heidi St. John. I've read multiple books by her and done a couple studies from her, and it felt a lot more like that than her other things have. And it still had some really good stories and insights in it. So I enjoyed it. I think I would recommend it more to someone who has not been married that long and maybe has younger kids or maybe is new to homeschooling. Then I read my next Sherlock Holmes book, His Last Bow. This is a collection of short stories. There were 8 short stories in this book. This might be my favorite short story Sherlock collection so far. My very favorite short story in here is the one that the title comes from, His Last Bow. And then my other favorites were The Adventure of the Devil's Foot, The Adventure of the Bruce Partington Plans, and The Adventure of the Red Circle. Again, I'm just really glad I'm reading through all of these books. I am thoroughly enjoying them, and this, like I said, this one is probably my favorite of the short stories. Then I read The Secret of Tate's Beach. This is one of the books that The Good and the Beautiful publishes, and this tells the story of a girl who has had an illness, and so her dad takes her to this island to stay with some people that live on the island for a while. It had kind of a mystery to it. They were looking for treasure. I expected this to be kind of exciting. It wasn't. They have it as level 6. The Good and the Beautiful has all of their books in levels, and I think they go up to 10, which a 10 would be kind of an adult level. There's not really a grade equivalent to them, but this one was a level 6, and it felt like it was a lot younger than that. Very simple story. Didn't love it, didn't hate it, but it wasn't very memorable. And then I read another book from that collection. This one is a level 2B. It's called Little Glass Lake Ducks. It's definitely for younger kids. I like to have all the books on our shelves be ones that I've read, and so that was why I wanted to check this one out. I thought it looked really cute, and it's a cute little kid story. It's basically just kids getting to know new neighbors and watching the duck eggs. There was not much to the story. Very simple. And if you were shopping for the Good and the Beautiful books and you had a kid that really liked ducks, that they probably would like this book, but it's not one I would go searching for. Then I did my reread of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, and of course I loved it. I'm not going to say too much about this because like I said in my Harry Potter readathon announcement video, I will be doing videos on the Harry Potter books during the month of September, so I will talk more about this one then, but I did enjoy it, and I'm really glad to be rereading the series this year. Then I read Death Comes as the End by Agatha Christie. My oldest daughter, had read this already, and she's been waiting for me to finally get to it so we could talk about it. This is very different from what I expected, and it's very different from every other Agatha Christie book I've read. This actually takes place in ancient Egypt. I thought for some reason that it was about ancient Egypt, but I didn't know that it took place in that time period. So that's a little bit different to have a mystery that isn't with the detectives that she usually writes about. I thought it was good. It wasn't my favorite, but I did find it very interesting, and it was fun to read something from her that was so different. I was wrong. My daughter apparently did get it right of whodunit. I did not. The last of the books I read by myself was Casino Royale by Ian Fleming. I finished this during mine and Lucy's reading sprints the other night. This is the first James Bond book, and I just wanted to read it because I've seen the James Bond movies. It's been a while since I've seen most of them, but I read the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang from him, and I thought that was a really fun book. And so I was very interested to see what his writing would be like for James Bond. I would say that 2/3 of this I really enjoyed. I was very into it at the beginning. I thought it was interesting, well written. I started to get a little bit bored with the casino scenes because watching people gamble in a movie is, I think, more interesting than reading about it when it's detailed. But I was enjoying the book. And then towards the end, there were a few scenes that were more violent, but it was okay. I kind of expected that, and I still didn't think they were too over the top. But then all of a sudden there was some open door romance going on, and I know going into a James Bond book I probably should have expected that a little bit, but I think from the time period I just assumed that the book wouldn't have that and that maybe that was only going to be in the movies, but it was definitely there. It wasn't the worst I've ever read, but it definitely had some things in it that I could have done without. I didn't like the ending, so I was disappointed in this book. Like I said, I still enjoyed it. I'm glad I read it, but I probably won't read anymore. I also felt like the romance, it kind of felt insta-lovey to me too. And so, yeah, I wish that part had been left out. And if it had, I would have liked it more, but I still would have been disappointed with the ending. So either way, it was a little bit of a disappointing read. And as we wrapped up our school year, we also finished quite a few of the books that we've been reading over the last few months. One of them was this YWAM biography about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This tells the story of a man who is a pastor and a theologian, and he lives during the time of World War II. And he works in, I don't want to spoil it but I'm assuming everybody kind of knows who he is. So he worked in the spy network that was trying to assassinate Hitler. And this book is just his whole life story. I thought it was really good. However, I do think that the book, The Faithful Spy, about him, I think that probably would capture kids' attention a little bit more than this one would. We also finished up Major Wars, History Bites by Solomon Schmidt. This just goes through 30 different wars in the history of the world, and it gives a little blurb about each one. So that's why it's called History Bites. He just gives a little bite of each one, just enough information that you know about it. And then if you want to read more, you can go find out more. And I enjoyed reading this with my girls. I think some of them weren't as interesting as others. I think he does a good job of summarizing the wars down to a couple of pages with pictures. We also started reading The Trumpeter of Krakow. And if you've read this and loved it, let me know, because we started reading this out loud and I was not into it. I don't know why. I was having a really hard time staying engaged. And both of my daughters said the same thing. So we did not get very far into this book before we DNF'd it. And they both said that they weren't enjoying it at all. So we decided to move on to something else that they would enjoy more. But if this is worth continuing on, let me know and maybe I'll read it by myself. Then we finished The Tuttle Twins Guide to Logical Fallacies by Connor Boyack. We have really enjoyed the Tuttle Twins books in the past. And so I bought this set of the teenage books that included the logical fallacies. We did a logic course from Master Books last year. And so this school year, we were reading through this one a week just for a review of those. But I would say that this is actually a little bit of a disappointment. So I'll probably do a bigger video on that when I do homeschool videos on different curricula. But this is definitely not as good as the logic course we did. And there were times when he would introduce a logical fallacy and then give an example, and my daughter would say, wait, that wasn't a good example of that, and go into the whole reason of why that particular example did not use the fallacy correctly. And every time she did that, I believe she was correct. It went with my understanding of it as well. And then we finished The Mona Lisa Vanishes by Nicholas Day. This is one that I read during middle grade March this year, and I really enjoyed it. I knew my daughters would like it. And so as we got to this point in history, we read this as a read aloud, and I actually enjoyed this even more reading it out loud. It was so much fun to read out loud, and my girls liked it too. We all laughed quite a few times during it. He's a really engaging writer. They said that they didn't like the info dumps, but I actually like the info dumps. The info dumps basically are that he is telling the story of the Mona Lisa getting stolen from the Louvre. He goes back in time, and there'll be flashbacks to different things. So he'll go back and tell the story of Leonardo da Vinci. He goes back and tells the story of Lisa Gherardini. And he also tells backstories on the investigators, on the thief, and also on crime and forensics and different things of that era. And so I found it really interesting. And so definitely they felt like it was a little bit info dumpy, but I didn't. I enjoyed that part of it. But they enjoyed it overall, and I really enjoyed it. And as far as the last books they read in school over the past couple of months, my 18-year-old read The Clockwork Sparrow. She really liked this, and she is planning on reading the rest of the series. She also read The Goose Girl by Shannon Hill, and I thought she was going to absolutely love it. She said that she thought it was good, but she didn't like it nearly as much as I thought she was going to. My younger daughter read the manga classic Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and she liked this. She didn't love it, but she thought it was okay. She also read Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and she liked this one too. Her favorite probably of the year, I think, was El Defo. And I read this a couple of years ago and thought it was great, and I had my older daughter read it, and she didn't really seem like she loved it that much. So this was kind of a last minute addition that I gave to my youngest in place of something else I was gonna have her read. And yeah, she liked the art and she thought the story was good. So obviously a lot of books this month. And as far as where they all fit in the readathon that I was doing and in my challenges, for the Read Your Bookshelf challenge for the Maud and Doyle side, both, it was a short story collection. So I used the Sherlock book, His Last Bow, for both of those. And then also, obviously, for continuing on with my Sherlock challenge. And for the Read Around the World-a-thon, the prompt for July was written by an author from another country. I had planned on reading Casino Royale for that, and I did. The Buzzword-a-thon, the word was measurement. So that was the main reason I did the small child book, The Little Glass Lake, Mansfield Park for Emma's book club, and Chamber of Secrets for my Harry Potter read this year. I was able to mark off a few books on Tiffany's book bingo, but for the Beaches and Books readathon, for the go to the library and pick a book, since I don't have a library, I crossed that out and go to my TBR cart and pick a book. And originally that's what I was going to do, but I wanted it to be something I hadn't planned on reading before the month. And so I saw Pygmalion, and I hadn't been planning on getting that book, and so I bought it, and so I ended up using that for that prompt. A book you save for later was A Sky of Paper Stars. A book that made waves in the community, I used When the Day Comes for that. A book you think will be 5 stars, I put The Extraordinary Deaths of Mrs. Kipp, so I was right. It did end up being a 5-star. A book about friends, I used The Little Glass Lake Ducks for that as well. A book with an underwater setting is why I read Submerged. Has the sun or the color yellow on the cover, I used Death Comes as the End for that. A book with royalty or a castle on the cover is why I read Loyally Luke. A book about sports I used Harry Potter for that because of Quidditch. A book with 2 points of view, The Secret of Tate's Beach, I used that. And read a book during a rainstorm. We did not have a single rainstorm during July, but one of the live sprints, they used an ambiance that had rain, so I counted that, and I was reading Mansfield Park at the time. And then a book set in a beach town was the one I did not think I was going to be able to get, but then Casino Royale was in a beach town, and I read that the very last day of July. So I was able to mark that off. So I actually was able to get all of the prompts for the Beaches and Books Readathon. I was very excited I was able to do that. That's the most I've read in any month so far this year, by far. And I'm hoping I'm going to be able to keep up that momentum in August and beyond, because there are quite a few books I want to get to. My favorite book of the month was The Extraordinary Deaths of Mrs. Kipp, followed closely by When the Day Comes. So let me know if you've read any of these books and enjoyed them or hated them.